most people, the music industry represents a source of harmless fun and entertainment. Beneath the glossy veneer, however, lies the devastating truth of who really controls these institutions and the deeply malevolent agendas for which they're being used. Mark Devlin is a UK-based club and radio DJ and music journalist, specializing in black and dance music in its many forms. He's also an author. Mark's latest book is Musical Truth, a culmination of 5 years of research into the true nature of the music industry. The book examines the dark forces that have been manipulating and controlling the mainstream music industry for decades, and how this ties into the much larger picture of what is really going on in the world. Mark, how are you doing today, or this evening?
Hey, Tim. I'm good, man. It's both, really, isn't it? It's afternoon for you and evening for me.
Yes. So that's living on a globe, I guess, right? So
Maybe not. Who knows?
So anyway, the music industry, your book, Musical Truth. What motivated you to write the book? Let's just get into it. What's that book about? I've read it, but maybe people in my audience haven't. So let's go into it.
Well, the book brings together everything I've come to understand about the true nature of the corporate music industry, but also the entertainment industry at large, because it ties very much into what happens through Hollywood movies and the TV industry and, other aspects of entertainment. And it's based on 5 years worth of research. So in 2010, I had a bit of a sort of epiphany and a light bulb went off in my head, and I started to see the world in very different ways to what had previously been the case. So I refer to it as a conscious awakening. It was a lifting of the veil in terms of great truths about this reality in which we find ourselves, the true nature of it, who's really running the show, and, what we're doing here, what the game plan is. So I came to a lot of understandings in that year. And from that point on, I just threw myself into research, looking at the work of many different authors and writers and filmmakers and scholars, trying to put all the pieces together and trying to understand how everything worked and how it all fitted together. It was pretty much a case of ripping up everything that I'd come to understand about, or I'd come to be programmed to understand about what's going on in this world, and starting again with a blank sheet of paper. That's the analogy I often use, because that's pretty much what it was. And then reconstructing my entire worldview and paradigm. So up to that point, I'd been a DJ for 20 years, a radio and club DJ. And I still do it, but to a much lesser extent than I used to. And I wanted to understand how the industry that I'd been a part of, the music industry, had been used for decades for purposes of mind control and social manipulation and behavior modification and all these different things that you find out are being done. And so that's why it took 5 years to get the information together that went into that book. I went to a very wide, eclectic array of sources to draw the information. And everything that I know is between the covers of that book now, which I put out about 3 months ago. So anyone getting the book is going to know pretty much as I know in terms of how it all fits together. So it's 170,000 words. It took 13 months to write, and it was based on those 5 years worth of uncovering information, as I say. And I'd always found it quite easy to communicate through writing. I'd been a music journalist as well as a DJ. I used to write for magazines back in the day, so I was very familiar with conveying meaning and putting information across in written form, which is a skill I think I have. There's lots of things that I'm pretty lousy at, but there's one or two that I'm half decent at, and hopefully writing is one of them. So in a nutshell, that's how the book came about, mate.
Well, I can testify to that. The book is well written. It's an easy read. It's very, you can just burn through it. So the writing style is very very pleasant.
Well, people have said that,
yeah.
And I appreciate those comments. And I've got some really good reviews on Amazon as well. All the reviews have been positive, and the consistent point that people make is the fact that it's very easily digestible, and you don't need any special background knowledge to understand the points that I'm putting across. It's written with a very wide audience in mind, or readership, and I try and break things down so that anyone who's entirely new to this information can take on board what I'm trying to put across. So it's very satisfying when people observe that, that they do find it to have been written in that way, because that was the plan.
Now, in it, you again, as we mentioned, you're uncovering or you're exposing the true nature of the music industry and the forces that control it, and how it incorporates into the broader, I guess, New World Order agenda, primarily through culture control or culture creation, I suppose. Um, the the importance of music, I think it was Plato wrote in a Republic that musical innovation is full of danger to the state. For when modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state always change with them. So the arts, music being one of them, of course, are very important. And the powers that be aren't going to take a laissez-faire approach to them. They're going to be manipulated for the purposes of political control. So the broad thesis of your book and other researchers, to me, shouldn't be very controversial to anyone who's informed. About the importance of the arts, the importance of controlling the culture to control the political process, right?
Yeah, right. To anyone that's paying attention, it shouldn't be
Yeah.
too much of a shock because the powers that shouldn't be have taken great care to subvert and hijack and manipulate and control and direct so many aspects of our daily lives. So they've absolutely taken over the financial and banking institutions. They've got the world of politics in their pocket. You know, they've taken over science and academia, all the colleges, all the universities, the schooling system. They've taken over the military intelligence communities, the military industrial complex. So when they've done all that, they're not going to leave something like entertainment to chance, and they're not going to let art forms develop naturally and organically without wanting to control every aspect of those as well, at least in terms of the upper levels and in terms of the household names that everyone's heard of. So the thing about entertainment and music specifically is that people come to it. You don't even have to ram this stuff down people's throats because everyone loves some form of music. It might be opera, it might be classical, it might be country and western, it might be heavy rock, but everyone from the ages of, 5 to their deathbed likes some kind of music. So what a great opportunity for mass mind control and social engineering through these scenes. If you seek to subvert and, debase culture in that way and shape people's attitudes and perceptions. It really is a great way of doing it. And of course, this is what we've seen occurring through the decades. And it does go way back, like you say, how interesting that Plato was making comments about the effect that music can have on the masses way back in his day. And it's fed all the way through the classical music greats of the Middle Ages onwards, up to the modern music industry as we understand it to be now from the 1950s onwards. So there's evidence of the hidden hand everywhere. And there are connections going back into military intelligence and the so-called security services, CIA, FBI, MI5, MI6, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, all the way through. We touched on this just before we started the interview, and it's very much the crux of what I put forward in my book and what many other researchers put forward as well. And we were talking about the work of Dave McGowan and Jan Irvin and the stuff he's done with Hans Utter and Joe Atwill specifically. And so all these guys have identified the links between the music industry and all these kind of military intelligence and government departments. And there really should be no links there at all. You started this show with that bit of blurb about the fact that to most people, the music industry represents a source of harmless fun and entertainment. And that's exactly what it should be. And that's the way most people still think of it as. So why should it be that there are so many connections back into these, governmental and military institutions? And why should it be that there's all kinds of other stuff going on beneath the surface as well, such as dark ritual, occult activity, Satanism, paedophilia and child abuse, satanic ritual abuse, and trauma-based mind control. These sound like the plots to really scary Hollywood movies. So what the hell are all these influences doing in the entertainment industry if it is just about that? Entertainment, having a bit of fun, having a laugh, and forgetting all your worries.
And of course, the occult the occult factors much into the nature and the culture of the intelligence agencies, and that goes way back to the age of John Dee and
Sure.
the Elizabethan era. The idea of basically secret knowledge to keeping it away from the public, so you have, I guess you could say, a measure of advantage over them. and that
Sure.
factors into Freemasonry as well.
That's right. It's
Yeah.
gaining a tactical advantage
Mhm.
over your opponent by holding on to knowledge that you're aware of and they're not. So you're keeping it occulted or hidden. And so in the intelligence community, people think of that information as sort of spy stuff, national security secrets to protect the country and stuff like that. But it can equally be information about the true nature of reality and the forces of the universe and the spiritual and metaphysical dynamics which are at work. That stuff is just as valuable for those in control to want to keep from the general population so that they have no awareness of this. And that's why the worlds of espionage and the dark occult have overlapped so much through the ages, as you say. Famously, the Elizabethan era in England, the time of Queen Elizabeth I, you had Sir John Dee and Sir Francis Bacon that were both connected to Queen Elizabeth, and they were both, ceremonial magicians and guys that understood magic with a K and how that all works. And there's lots more to know about them as well. Many people think Sir Francis Bacon was actually William Shakespeare and put out the works of Shakespeare, and that there was no such person as William Shakespeare as such. But that's another story. And I was doing a podcast just recently with Jay Dyer, and I'm going to be putting this out tomorrow. And Jay Dyer gets into analysing Hollywood movies and all the symbolism and stuff that lies beneath the glossy surface there. And we were talking about Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. And of course, the James Bond stories are all about espionage, and Ian Fleming would know a thing or two about it, given that he worked for military intelligence during the Second World War and beyond. He was a naval officer, and he was connected to Aleister Crowley, as we discussed in our chat. Fleming and Crowley, there's evidence to suggest that they actually knew each other. So you've got a link straight away there between military intelligence and dark occultism. And there are many others. There's this guy, Michael Aquino, who was connected to the US military for many years. And he was into some pretty dark, satanic, occult stuff in terms of rituals and all the rest of it. So these two aspects do overlap. But again, both of them, in turn, overlap into the entertainment industry and the music industry specifically. And so that's an area that I've wanted to understand. And, we get into many ways in which these different institutions do overlap in the book. It's very interesting that they do. And there's a lot of stories going on beneath the surface here.
Yes, of course, the connection between Hollywood and the Pentagon and CIA is well established. It's documented. They have liaison offices that supposedly work to help produce movies. But of course, contingent on that help is letting the Pentagon or CIA write the script of certain movies and promote certain viewpoints or attitudes toward those agencies, or creating a certain worldview with some of their movies, whether it's Top Gun, or one of the various, I guess many researchers have done work on some of the movies that the CIA has been involved with, and also TV shows like Cake Wars, things you wouldn't imagine that the CIA is interested in helping produce for some reason. And it's all about culture. Again, it goes back to a whole bunch of culture creation. I've had the benefit, or the pleasure of interviewing Jay Dyer a few times.
Right. And
he writes about that a lot, and it's a rich area to research because of all those connections. But we also, what we have here with music industry, the film industry, and all this, again, we get back to this. Most people's understanding of the world they get through that medium. Even in writing, people read more. The intelligence agencies were very, very interested in writing books. Like you've mentioned, some of the old British spies, of the last century. They were also writers like Ian Fleming, and also Roald Dahl wrote children's stories, right?
Sure, Roald Dahl and Dennis Wheatley, who wrote occult books like The Devil Rides Out and such. And all of these guys came out of the same sort of military intelligence communities, and they were put to work as authors and screenwriters, So they were shaping public perception of things with their intelligence backgrounds all the way through the last century. And we find these links time and time again. And that's what I'm finding so interesting about listening to the work of Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill when they're putting forward evidence to support the manipulation of every aspect of popular culture, whether it's books, whether it's movies, whether it's music, whether it's TV shows, even down to celebrity chefs we were talking about, even the infiltration of that particular genre. The hidden hand is everywhere. So it really does seem to be the case that nothing is left to chance. And these individuals and these networks that we're talking about who are controlling and manipulating everything have to be in control of everything. They're not going to let a scene grow and develop and mutate by itself without wanting to dictate the direction that it goes in. And they've been doing it forever.
And Wheatley too. He knew Aleister Crowley as well, didn't he?
Right, I believe he did. Yeah.
I think
all those guys were connected. Dahl knew Fleming, and they in turn knew Crowley. So,
and Wheatley, I think he was quoted as saying that he would never let Crowley watch his children, nor would he ever loan him money. That was his understanding of Crowley. But I was listening to J. Dye did an interview with an author of a book called Crowley Agent 666.
Okay.
Recently, I don't know if you've heard the interview. It's a fascinating interview. He has it on his webpage there.
No, I've not heard that yet.
It's a great analysis of Crowley. It's sort of like very objective analysis of Crowley himself, not going so much into Satanism, to condemn it, just to explain it. And Crowley himself is kind of a showman, and this is kind of a trait you see with these characters. They're kind of showmen, and they themselves might be interested in marketing their own accentuating the evil in their personality in order to make them more marketable. This is why they're why someone like Crowley is so admired by rock stars and stuff like that. So but he was talking about how Crowley. Why would British intelligence have any interest in Aleister Crowley? And he's explaining sort of there's a practical interest in that because Crowley dabbled in the occult and a lot of Eastern rites and mysteries and of course, if you're running a global empire, you're going to need that sort of anthropological or ethnographic understanding of these places, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of a story. I don't know if you've heard this one. I can't remember which researcher brought it across my radar because when you throw yourself into this type of research, you forget, which podcast you heard something on or which author you read it from. But there was a story about Winston Churchill during the Second World War, assembled a group of witches. And he got them up on the famous White Cliffs of Dover, and they were, they were put to work with trying to repel the invasion of German fleets coming towards the British Isles. And, he got these witches to perform this ceremony, this occult ceremony, to kind of dissipate the military power of the Germans and kind of turn it back on themselves to protect the land of the United Kingdom. Have you come across that story before?
No, that's the first I've heard of it, but it's interesting because that parallels John Dee and the Spanish Armada, correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
Didn't he conjure up a tempest or something? That was a story.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. And all these stories just reinforce what we're talking about here, which is that dark occult ritual practices and magic with a K ceremonies have gone hand in hand with military intelligence through the ages. And, again, the question would be, why should there be any link between these two? But it's all the world of the occult, isn't it? Whether it's surveillance information or whether it's information about how reality works. It's all keeping it hidden from those that don't need to know and keeping it within the confines of a select few in a secret society type manner.
Yeah, and for those who find some of the talk of black magic is strange and woo-woo stuff, there is a practical relationship between some of these satanic groups or occult groups and CIA, as you mentioned, or intelligence groups, because they're both involved in secreted knowledge. But some of these groups can act as assets of the intelligence agencies. They can be involved in human trafficking, drug running, and engage in all types of criminal activity, while getting things done for the intelligence agencies, while the intelligence agencies can keep an arm's length from these groups and still have plausible deniability.
There you go. Plausible deniability is a very powerful thing. When you do keep these organizations at a certain arm's length, then if ever the heat comes on you and people start scrutinizing the nature of the link, you've got plausible deniability by saying, well, come on now, these two areas are completely unrelated. What possible connection could there be? But let me just say the world of the occult and the world of what people would term the paranormal is very, very real. I mean, I've come to understand this. A few years ago, you would have found me denying it. I was a flat out atheist for a number of years. I was in complete denial of anything metaphysical or spiritual or anything beyond this realm. I very much believed that we were just kind of accidents of the cosmos, and we just found ourselves this life form here on this rock floating through space, and we just had to make the best of it. We're on our own. That was my worldview. But I've absolutely turned that on its head, and I've completely come to understand that that is another method of social control, really. You have people that are deeply religious, and they often get steered towards some organized world religion or other, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism. So people are controlled and kept in the box by way of the dogma and the rules and regulations that come from those religions. But then they've also got a method of mentally and spiritually enslaving those that reject organized religions. And that's when you get into the worlds of atheism and scientism and Darwinism. And I was into all of those things for a period when I knew no better. But once I'd started doing the research, and once I'd opened myself up in terms of raising my consciousness and getting on the path to truth, I came to understand that in actual fact, there are spiritual components to this reality big time, and that we're all aspects of infinite consciousness. And it's not possible to explain all the things that I detail in my book adequately unless you have an acceptance of the fact that this dynamic is at play within the universe and we're all a part of it. My book goes into things like the suggestion of ritual sacrifice, the suggestion of demonic possession, satanic ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control, which are very real and completely able to be documented, and all kinds of strange synchronicities and synchromysticism and other unexplained occult elements. And you cannot provide an adequate explanation for why all these things go on and why they're so interlinked if you're working on the basis that this world is all there is, this physical reality, and nothing goes on beyond this. The controllers that are directing and manipulating these industries absolutely understand the true nature of reality and what lies beyond this physical realm, and they're using it against the rest of us each and every day. So the rest of us really do need to get wise to the methods that are being used and to try and take on some of the understandings and some of the knowledge that these individuals are working with and are using against us. So we were talking earlier about mathematical odds of things just happening a certain way. So with the stuff that I'm detailing in the book, in so many cases, the odds of these incidences occurring just by chance or just one of those things or just by coincidence really do get into the realms of millions upon millions to one. So I've had to deflect quite a few skeptics since I've gone public with all this stuff. I do public talks now, and I put videos on YouTube, and I've got the book, and I do radio shows and podcasts. And every now and again, I'll get an email or a YouTube comment or a comment in a Facebook thread from somebody just telling me I'm talking bollocks and, there's no foundation to any of this stuff, and where's my proof? And so I'm constantly having to deflect skeptical points of view. And you find that often these skeptical people don't really have any ammunition beyond saying it's just the way it goes. It's just what happens. It's just one of those things. So, I would just invite people to use their logic and common sense, but more importantly, use their intuition and open themselves up to their higher selves when looking at all this information, and ask themselves whether it resonates with them, what I and many other researchers are putting across, because it's not just me that's saying all this stuff that's in my book. I've drawn my information from a wide variety of other researchers, and you'll find many others reinforcing the things that I'm saying and putting across the same perspectives on things. So I just invite people to ask whether the information that we're putting across resonates and, makes sense in some meaningful way, or whether we're talking crap, as some of the skeptics claim. So I just wanted to throw that out there because there's some people that are just not having it, no matter how much evidence you place in front of them. And I really don't know how much more somebody like me can do other than lay it all out in the book the way I have.
Well, I think it was Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain who said it's easier to fool someone than it is to convince someone that he has been fooled.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big hurdle for a lot of people, especially people who consider themselves informed or intelligent. Is it's harder to convince them because they have so much emotional, even maybe perhaps even financial capital invested in the current system.
Well, yeah, they do. The other thing you hear all the time is it seems you can convince people of anything except the truth. They'll swallow any kind of deception or any lie, but when it comes to truthful information, people have a real hard time swallowing that. And it's interesting what you say about when people reach a certain point in life, get to a certain age, it gets more and more difficult for them to reaffirm their worldview and, draw things up from scratch with that proverbial blank sheet of paper that I mentioned earlier, because you have a lot invested in the years and decades that you've been around in this physical realm. And, to admit at the age of 50 or 60 or whatever that you've been duped and conned and made a mug of is very difficult for the human ego to deal with, which is why you often have a hard time with older folk of getting them to accept that things might be rather different to what they've been told all their lives. It took me till the age of 40 to wake up, and I'm astounded that there's so much I couldn't see up until that point, because I see it so clearly now, and you think, how could I have been so blind? But, often people spend an entire human lifetime and get into their 80s or whatever, just being manipulated and deceived the whole time. And it's a travesty that this can take place. And people will often block out information that people bring to them and dismiss it as rubbish because their ego is getting in the way and they don't want to admit that they're capable of being fooled. They see themselves as a smart guy or a smart woman, and they think, well, you can't fool me. This can't possibly be the case. Otherwise, I would have known. So I know I'm jumping about a bit here, but I think it's all relevant.
No, it's true. I mean, it's especially if you're have academic training or professional, and they're the people
Absolutely.
who are considered opinions are worth something, but they're the most controlled. They're the most trained, and emphasis on the word trained. Look at medical doctors, and they're into that allopathic, Rockefeller type of medicine, and
Yeah.
how they're so well trained into pushing pills and pushing the allopathic approach that they've completely shut themselves off from any alternative medicine. So, and a good example is, if you go to any academically trained historians, I mean, you cannot have a meaningful position in a university unless you teach the official history.
That's right. The more deeply entrenched you are into a particular subject area or a particular walk of life, the more difficult it is for you to break out of that mindset and admit that you've been fooled and that things are rather different to what you thought. I kind of had to go through that because I spent many years as a DJ in the music industry going along with certain agendas. I can see now how the music was changed over those 2 decades that I was out there playing it, and certain artists were being ushered in and the production styles were changing very slowly and lyrical themes were changing and visual stuff in videos was changing, but because it was done in a slow drip kind of way, like the boiling frog syndrome, I didn't notice it happening, so I was taken in that way. But like you say, when people come from an academic background or they're heavily involved in a certain industry, such as the pharmaceutical industry, it's very difficult for them to accept alternative things because it involves them admitting that they were taken in. And it's interesting because I speak to a lot of original generation Beatles fans. I do a lot of public talks, and quite often there's, old boys of sort of 60 or 70 years of age, and I start talking about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and particularly when I get into the Paul McCartney replacement theory, Paul is dead, I get some very mixed reactions to that when I raise it in public talks. And quite often you get fellas in their 60s and 70s that were around in the 1960s, and so they remember the Beatles, they remember the Laurel Canyon scene, they remember the hippie counterculture scene, and they're absolutely not having it that there could have been any involvement from the CIA or the Tavistock Institute, or that any of these acts could have in any way been directed and manipulated by other parties behind the scenes. And even Dave McGowan, we were talking about Dave McGowan earlier, and of course, Dave McGowan has done a lot of great work into showing how so many of the musicians that came out of that counterculture scene in the mid to late 1960s had connections through their families back into the military intelligence communities, CIA, and all the rest of it. I mean, he's like the leading authority on that. He broke the story of who Jim Morrison's father was, Admiral George Stephen Morrison, the naval commander involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that basically started the Vietnam War. But when I was interviewing Dave McGowan, the question of the Paul McCartney replacement came up, and he got very defensive in quite an aggressive way. And, he almost threatened to terminate the interview with me because I was someone that adhered to that theory, because he was so opposed to the suggestion that McCartney could have been replaced that the whole idea was just preposterous to him. So you got a guy that is perfectly willing to accept that Jim Morrison was not all we thought he was, and all those other artists coming out of Laurel Canyon. But when it comes to the suggestion that these same military intelligence communities could have been involved in a plot to cover up the fact that the real Paul McCartney was dead and replace him with somebody else, he found that idea just impossible. So I found that quite an interesting observation in cognitive dissonance and denial,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a hard thing for people to accept, even to consider, because of, the plausibility of it to many people. It just seems, how could someone of such public notoriety and fame, be replaced so fast, so quick? But that gets into what you're getting into there is the Beatles and what the Beatles represented, what that project really was.
Yeah.
And if it really was something that was orchestrated or at least manipulated from Tavistock, and there's more and more evidence to indicate that the Beatles, was an enterprise that was aided and along by the British establishment. I mean, look at George Martin, the EMI records. These people were sound specialists that had connections to the military, to Britain's military establishment.
Exactly.
And what they were pushing, and if you look at the Beatles as they went sort of through this metamorphosis, where they came on in 1964 as these, clean-cut, lads from Liverpool, and they were gradually transformed into these psychedelic rockers. There was a quote I have here from Michael Hoffman in his book Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, and he's talking about the Kennedy assassination and the British invasion, and how the two are related. And he writes, what ought to be unambiguous to any student of mass psychology, it is the almost immediate decline of the American people in the wake of the shocking televised slaughter. There are many indicators of the transformation. Within a year, Americans had largely switched from softer-toned, naturally colored cotton clothing to garish-colored artificial polyesters. Popular music became louder, faster, more cacophonous. Drugs appeared for the first time outside the bohemian subculture ghettos in the mainstream. Extremes of every kind came into fashion. Revolutions in cognition and behavior were on the horizon, from the Beatles to Charles Manson, from free love to LSD. And if you take into consideration that what the Beatles represented and how big they were and how they were promoted, in 1957, the Life magazine promoted the use of mushrooms as a psychedelic drug, and that's been linked to the MK Ultra Project 58.
Right.
Gordon Wasson, who was PR head for J.P. Morgan, this connecting Wall Street to intelligence to journalism, because Time Life was always an adjunct of the intelligence communities, because the guy who ran it, Henry Luce, was a skull and bonesman, and and C.D. Jackson, the Life magazine guy, was an intelligence guy. But they're promoting drug use in 1957, and 10 years later, on the very same pages of Life magazine, Paul McCartney is promoting LSD use.
Yeah. Links everywhere you look.
Yeah. Now, again, there are other people who've gotten into the Paul McCartney switcheroo thing, and I think there's various ways you can look at that, because it's you can look at some of the evidence. I think there's that doctors out of Italy who did the comparison on the face and
forensic experts.
There's the ears, the teeth, and all that. The
Well,
band's,
there's
yeah,
so much evidence, and I
the,
break it down in the book. I mean, one of the biggest chapters in the book is my one on Paul is Dead, where
yeah.
I spend 15,000 words laying the whole thing out. And people often come up to me at talks and stuff, and they say, is it true that Paul McCartney's dead? And they want an answer in 30 seconds. And you can't do this subject area justice in soundbite form. So it's not something that you can adequately explain in a couple of sentences as you're putting your coat on,
Yeah.
ready to leave, ready to walk out the door. You really, if you want to get to the bottom of this, and you really want to understand whether there's any validity to these claims, you need to invest quite a bit of time, and you need to really delve into the information with an open mind if you're going to get anything out of it. So there's a reason why this chapter is so long, because I started writing it and then it went on and on and on and on, and I went off in this direction and that direction, down this rabbit hole and down that dead end street, So it really did take so much time to assimilate all the information. I've just finished reading a great book by a guy called Nick Colostrom, Professor Nicholas Colostrom, who used to be connected to the University of London. He's quite a controversial author now, and I highly respect him because he's written books on the 7/7 London terror attacks, so-called, which were in fact a classic false flag in the spirit of 9/11. He's done work exposing the hollow hoax, so-called, the suggestion that the official story of the Jewish Holocaust was grossly exaggerated and didn't happen the way we were told. And he's written a book on the fact that Paul McCartney was replaced. And it's called The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. So he's a guy that has no problem with calling it as he sees it. And I've just finished the book. And as I said in an interview the other day, I would challenge anyone to read Nick's book and get from one end of it to the other and look at all the evidence that he lays out, photographic evidence, as well as forensic evidence and symbolic clues and all that sort of thing. And if you can still get to the other end of that book and be convinced that the guy we have in the world today calling himself Paul McCartney is the original Paul McCartney, then I will be dumbfounded. And if you consider the suggestion that McCartney could have been replaced, the only way this could have happened without it becoming public knowledge and without there being massive disclosure is with the full complicity of the military intelligence services. And in Britain, that would be MI5 and MI6. So what were we talking about a short while ago? All these connections between these institutions and the music industry. And I'm just making the point that the only way this McCartney cover-up could have occurred is if they were fully on board with it. So the Queen, that nice, dear old lady, knighted McCartney, of course. He became a Knight of the Realm, so he's now a Sir. And actually, all the Beatles received MBEs back in the 1960s. And John Lennon later returned his in protest, so much respect to him for that. But, the Queen has knighted these individuals, and McCartney in particular. And McCartney, or perhaps we should call him Paul, Faux Paul, as he's known, has appeared at many public events and performed concerts in the Queen's honour in more recent years. So he seems to be well in there with the royals, and he's hobnobbing with them the whole time, so he's definitely a part of the establishment now. And so there would have had to have been complicity all the way up to the Queen, through her connections with MI5 in terms of this being covered up. And that is the only way that it could have been. And I'm suggesting that that's exactly what happened. And when you read Nick Colostrom's book, when you listen to other researchers like Tina Foster of the Plastic Maca blog site, and there's a woman called Claire Kuhn that has done a lot of work into this. There's a guy called Toby Malamute. I did a podcast with him recently. And when you read what I've written in my book about the whole thing, then there it is. It's all laid out for you. And if you still emerge the other side of all that information, including this evidence from those Italian forensic experts who actually set out at the outset to disprove this ridiculous idea that Paul McCartney could possibly have been replaced. And when they actually came to assemble all the evidence and did all the photographic comparisons and stuff like that, they came out the other side with the exact opposite view. And they insisted that this can't possibly be the same person. So they completely changed their standpoint on it when they actually looked at the information. So, anyone that can take all that on board and still come out the other side and say, no, this guy is Paul McCartney, then I don't know what to tell you, really.
Well, again, it seems outrageous if you don't really think about it. But remember what the Beatles were. What many of these acts are, even actors, that these are public personas that don't really exist.
Yeah, lifetime actors.
Lifetime actors. They're on the stage, and like anything, they're playing a role, and they can always bring in new people to fill the role in.
Sure.
And it's again, it goes back into the question of what entertainment is and how it's manipulated or weaponized. Um, the notion that such a thing could be pulled off, it isn't that outrageous if you take into account, as you mentioned, is if you have the collusion or the involvement of the intelligence agencies, who have often resorted to sleight of hand, sorcery, or magician's tricks. I mean, magicians have always been hired by the intelligence agencies. Visual trickery, these things, and this would involve not just sleight of hand, but also the use of technology, and go back to the issue of occulted knowledge and maybe what technology is or isn't available, and what really is held in secret. It's hard for the person, the general public, to assess these things because they don't have all the information. I mean, our notions of what physics is and what science is based on what the Royal Society says it is.
That's right.
So the limitations of physics, or if they can be surpassed or manipulated in some ways, we may not know. So if these things can be pulled off, or if this was a project, long-standing project, the British invasion, was that an attempt by the British establishment to help reincorporate the United States into the Anglosphere again? And that goes back to the Rhodes Scholarship and the broad culture agenda that was perpetrated by the British establishment in the late 19th century to bring America back into the fold of the British Empire. And that involved all types of, like the Union Now League, or getting us involved in both world wars in the United States on behalf of the British Empire. That was that involved Hollywood, involved literature. We have the man called Intrepid William Stevenson here, his operation here at working out of Rockefeller Center, and he worked hand in glove, with the Roosevelt administration. So these things aren't impossible. I think again, what is people have an emotional attachment to these public personas, whether they're actors. I mean, if you were to come out and say that some of these actors, the real life of some of these actors, they're not willing to accept because their idea of the actor is the person they see on the silver screen.
Yeah. I mean, just sticking with the Beatles for a minute, and I'm not particularly trying to pick on the Beatles. It's just that they're the best example of what we're talking about here. And there's a reason why they were the number one group in the 1960s on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, that wouldn't have been left to chance. That would have been made to happen. I look at footage now of the Beatles in their early days when they all dressed the same and they had the same haircuts, and they said the same sort of things in interviews and cracked jokes at the same time, and they absolutely come across to me now with my broadened perspective on things as lifetime actors, or certainly actors at that time. They were fulfilling this role. There was the John, Paul, Ringo and George that the public knew and fell in love with, but that wasn't the four flesh and blood individuals that we were dealing with here. It was the public persona. So we see this the whole time. And I think the whole public persona of the Beatles was manufactured and, steered in a certain way throughout their career. And they would have been a continuation of what you were just talking about, these attempts to realign American attitudes with British Empire. There would be a reason why the Beatles just exploded onto the scene in the US overnight after that Ed Sullivan show in 1964, and why there were screaming mobs of girls going hysteric and losing their minds. And there's stories connected to that. There are eyewitness accounts of, in their very early days, before the Beatles actually became the sensational superstars that they were, there were groups of girls that were actually paid by the Beatles' handlers, by those that were managing them, to go up to them and scream and, lose their minds as they got out of a car or got off a plane or whatever, or performed at a concert. And so nobody knew really who these guys were at the time. It's very early days. And these crowds were paid to, have this kind of reaction to them. And then that was filmed. And then the press would report the fact that girls were losing their minds over these four heartthrobs from Liverpool. And then the general public reading that or seeing the footage or whatever would think, oh, well, these guys must be really special. Got to go to their concert, got to react in the same way and lose our minds about them as well. Mm-hmm. And so that's how they get the job done.
And of course, they have people in the press that report these stories.
Yeah.
And it's a self-perpetuating thing where you can actually manufacture a news story. That goes back to like Edward Bernays' thing with the Liberty torches and cigarettes,
Right.
where you can get people to think this is what everyone is doing, so then everyone starts doing it. And
Right.
you don't have to control every aspect of it. You can set it in motion. A certain momentum kicks in.
Right.
Cultural momentum will kick in and do a lot of the work for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Beatlemania was large. I mean, there is a plastic quality to all this stuff. That's one thing people don't have to realize, whether it's movies or music, is that it isn't real. You know,
That's right.
It's manipulated. It's made
As
up.
they said in Strawberry Fields,
Yeah.
nothing is real.
Nothing is real, and so the idea that the people playing this role cannot be switched out at some point. You know, that's it's hard to accept because it's someone like a figure like Paul McCartney is such a important popular music star, but you do have things that he did gain a few inches and his teeth are different and his
Well, absolutely. I mean,
eye color changed.
Yeah, just little things like that, you know.
But
it's right there in front of people, you know.
Also, a chance that a lot of part of this is psychological warfare. And we look at the weaponization of music and entertainment in general, and it's almost as if could they have done that on purpose to plant those inconsistencies, those anomalies, to just make everyone start
Well, yeah. I mean, when you start researching all this stuff, you find yourself so confounded and so confused and so tied up in knots sometimes that you do start to question your own sanity at certain points, and you think, am I losing my mind here? Or is a lot of this stuff put out there to deliberately wind up and confuse researchers and make them just not be able to discern reality from fantasy? I mean, a classic example of that occurred earlier this year, if we can just jump to this subject, when we got the news of the death of David Bowie.
Mm-hmm.
And the morning after the news broke of Bowie's apparent demise, there was a guy that they wheeled out on a Sky News show by the name of Jack Stephen. Did you see this at all?
No, I heard you talk about it before, though.
Right, okay. Well, people can find this on YouTube. The footage of the interview is there, and they can find images of this individual if they just do a Google search for it. So we had this guy that was presented as Jack Stephen, a long-standing music industry executive, and he was said to be the head of a music management company in London called Fortress Music, which certainly does exist, and he appears in the personnel of that company. But prior to this interview with this character that was presented as Jack Stephen, there was only one other piece of footage existing on the internet that researchers have been able to find. And it goes back to 2009. And so you have this dude that is identified as Jack Stephen, and he's at an event in Dallas. It's some sort of music forum, and he's talking about the music scene in Dallas. And he looks completely different and absolutely nothing like the individual that was presented as Jack Stephen in January 2016, 7 years later. It's quite clearly not the same person. So straight away you think, what the hell is going on there? Then you get the backstory of Jack Stephen, which is that he started his first company in the music industry in 1970. Now, to have started your own company in the music industry, you would probably have to be at least 20 years old then, I would suggest. Probably quite a bit older, but let's be generous and say you'd have to be about 20 years old to get a mission on the go like that. So that would mean that he was born in 1950, which would mean that in 2016 he's either 65 or 66 years of age. And I'm telling you, the individual that was identified as Jack Stephen on this Sky News broadcast looked nowhere near 65 or 66 years of age. Then there's the small matter of this guy on the Sky News broadcast just happening to look exactly like David Bowie. So they wheel out this guy to pay tribute to David Bowie and tell a couple of anecdotes about, when he was with him back in the day in the industry. And he looks just like bloody Bowie. And inevitably, this led a bunch of people looking at this footage to comment on or speculate on whether this was actually David Bowie after some elaborate plastic surgery. He's had his eye fixed, he's had a nose job, he's wearing a hairpiece, but are they actually parading him in front of the general public and kind of placing the truth in plain sight, which is one of their favourite tactics, but doing it in a very cryptic, crafty kind of way to kind of wind up and confuse and confound those that see this thing. You got to wonder, and there's got to be a reason why this guy looked completely different to the Jack Stephen that we saw previously. And so, of course, this has led many to question whether David Bowie did actually die or whether in some way his death could have been some kind of hoax. I really can't say one way or the other. I can certainly say that we get this when prominent musicians pass on, or when we're told that they do. We got it with Elvis Presley. There was a lot of denial from Elvis fans that he was actually dead, and the rumours have persisted for decades that, in fact, he went off to live out his remaining years somewhere in secret. And we got the same thing with Tupac in the hip-hop world, you know.
Yeah.
And people have said the same with Jim Morrison. People said it about Michael Jackson. It's pretty impossible to say whether this was the case in any of these instances, I suggest. But a lot of people seem to think that this sort of thing goes on. But either way, it goes back to what we just touched on, which is that anyone trying to get to the bottom of all these mysteries, and anyone trying to be a critically minded, truth-seeking researcher, is going to find themselves tied up in knots and just their brain turned to mashed potato at every turn, because there's so much conflicting information, there's so many anomalies, discrepancies, unanswered questions, things that just don't add up, mysteries and enigmas at every turn, that it becomes very, very difficult to be able to state with any certainty what is the truth and what isn't. And I just want to qualify the title of my book, actually, in that regard, because it's called Musical Truth. And I don't want people to think that absolutely everything that I'm stating in the book is the unequivocal truth, or that I'm claiming that it's the absolute truth. The reason I chose the title Musical Truth is because there is one consistent truth in everything that we're told via the mainstream media and via government departments and via Wikipedia and the sort of mainstream version of everything, which is that the official story of anything can generally be taken to be a pile of horseshit.
Yeah.
And if you want to get to the truth, you take the official version of anything, chuck it out, and start again and start looking in some different places, and then you might be able to assemble the truth. So the consistent, truthful factor is that the official version of anything very rarely makes an ounce of sense or stacks up in any way. So, when you come with that approach, you stand some chance of at least possibly uncovering the truth, I find, the real truth.
Now, of course, we're focusing on the music industry itself, and what is the music industry? What does it represent? One thing I found is how closely the music industry is tied to organized crime. Here in the United States, the Music Corporation of America was founded by one Jules Stein, who was a mobster by anyone's standards.
Right.
And the way he rose to the top of the music industry was through rather unscrupulous methods, the extortion, kidnapping, murder, or arson, and
all the usual.
Yeah. And so he rose to the top, went out to L.A., hired Lou Wasserman. Lou Wasserman became the kingpin in Hollywood, who sponsored people like Ronald Reagan, started his political career. So when some of the dark and disturbing, whether the strange deaths, when you look into who's controlling the music industry itself, it's not too surprising that some of the artists might meet their demise by less than unnatural means.
Right.
In the UK, you had the Cray twins, who were mobsters too, who were very influential in the music industry. Can you get into them?
The Cray twins were pretty much like the British equivalent of the Manson family, I guess. Charlie Manson was notorious in the 1960s over in the US, whereas in the UK, everyone was talking about the Cray twins. There were these East End mobsters, gangsters, criminal figures that came out of London and terrorized the whole scene in the 1960s. They were into various criminal activities, gambling rackets and prostitution and money laundering, that sort of stuff. And both of them ended up being jailed for individually murdering other criminal gangland characters. This was immortalized in 2 movies that there have been about the Krays. One of them starred the Kemp brothers, Martin and Gary Kemp, out of Spandau Ballet, the new romantic group out of the 1980s. They did a really good job of portraying the Krays, actually, in this 1990 film that was made about them. And more recently, last year, there was a movie called Legend starring Tom Hardy, and he played both Krays, Ronnie and Reggie, together. Are you still there, by the way?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought I'd lost the call again. Sorry, you'll have to edit that bit. So yeah, we had this movie where Tom Hardy is playing both of the Krays. And there were connections, it turns out, between the Kray twins going into the music industry of the 1950s and the 1960s. There's an article that I cite in the book that was written by a guy called T. Stokes. He was a former British intelligence officer that became a bit of an insider and whistleblower. And he produced this article that was later picked up on by a British writer called Chris Spivey, who kind of embellished it and did a bit of further research on it. And he published it on his website, chrisspivey.org. And it details an incredible synchronistic, interconnected labyrinth of links between what should be a widely disparate array of characters. So it includes everyone from Winston Churchill to politicians like Lord Bob Boothby and Tom Dryburgh. It includes the Kray twins. There are early British record industry music producers like Joe Meek, Kit Lambert, Robert Stigwood, Brian Epstein of the Beatles. A young Cliff Richard is involved. The notorious Jimmy Savile is involved. And you find there are links between all these different characters. And when it comes to the Kray twins, there's been a lot of evidence that's come to light in recent years to suggest that in addition to the criminal activities that we know about, the ones that are immortalized in these movies about them, they were actually involved in the procurement of children from so-called care homes to be supplied to elite paedophile rings, such as the ones we're hearing about now, operating out of the BBC and involved with Dolphin Square in Pimlico in London and the Elm Guest House in London. These are locations that have been linked with revelations about these paedophile rings that involve politicians and senior figures from the establishment, aristocrats, and actually going all the way up into royal circles as well when you really get down to it. So the suggestion is that the Krays were involved in supplying children to these rings. And one of the figures that has been exposed in recent years as well is Sir, there's another Sir, there's lots of Sirs in this story, Edward Heath, who was a British Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974. And even the mainstream press over here in the last couple of years or so has been publishing stories basically revealing the fact that Edward Heath was a paedophile, child rapist, and even a child killer. He used to have this yacht called Morning Cloud, which he used to sail over to Jersey. And he was known to take a bunch of young boys out on this yacht with him. And most of them were never seen or heard of again. So here we've got a prime minister that was in office for 4 years that has been subsequently exposed as a child molester. Only after his death, of course, because it only ever comes out after they've actually died and can't be brought to justice for it. But it just highlights how far up these elite paedophile rings go. And so with the Krays, there is the suggestion that this is some stuff that they were involved with. Also, there's the fact that they were twins. And a lot of researchers in this area have suggested that the Krays may have been the subject of mind control, trauma-based mind control experiments themselves. Because a lot of the early experiments that came out of what came to be known as MK Ultra, which was this trauma-based mind control system that came out of Nazi Germany, so the story goes, came out of the concentration camps in the Second World War. And then when many of the Nazi scientists that were involved in this stuff were brought over to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, they actually continued a bunch of these experiments that had been going on. And one of the key figures in all of this was the notorious Nazi scientist Dr. Joseph Mengele, who is portrayed by Gregory Peck in the movie The Boys from Brazil. And Mengele favoured experiments with twins because he was very interested to find out how twins would dissociate from reality when exposed to these horrific levels of trauma. And he wanted to see whether he could transplant the personality of one twin into the other with the close bond that there was between them. So it's all deeply sick and, horrific, malevolent stuff. But there are suggestions that the Krays may have been involved in that type of activity, which would account for their sudden mood swings. Again, this is something that comes out in the movies that you see about them. They would go from being very placid and urbane and calm to being violent and psychopathic at the drop of a hat. And it suggests that, they were mentally ill in some way. So could this have been the result of mind control experiments. So again, you have all these common elements: mind control and satanic ritual abuse and dark occult stuff, connections into military intelligence, paedophile rings, and the entertainment industry. Why are there any links between these elements that should be as far removed from each other as it's possible to get, and yet they are linked at every turn?
That's interesting because when you mentioned the Croatians and their involvement in procurement of children for pedophile rings, that's consistent with how some of these operations are reported to go down. Because, again, if you talk about pedophilia and sex traps or honey traps, these things, this is a method of control and blackmail that the intelligence agencies use to undermine governments to get control of them. In the United States, we had a situation here called the Franklin scandal, which you're probably somewhat aware of.
Right.
Of course, that involved Boys Town, which a the Catholic home for, it used to be for just for boys. Then by the time this was happening, it was both boys and girls, but this was being used by Lawrence King, who ran a savings and loans, and he was procuring young boys and girls for politicians and industry leaders. And this was linked to to a mansion in Washington, D.C., run by a man, Craig Spence, who's a Republican GOP lobbyist. His house was wired for audiovisual, and it was basically what was going on there was being videotaped and recorded.
Right.
And recently we have this case here, the Epstein case here. Are you familiar with that?
The Jeffrey Epstein
Yeah.
thing, yeah. Prince Andrew of the British royal family was implicated with him. And it's incredible because that made the headlines over here. What would it have been, 2 or 3 years ago now, I guess?
Yeah.
And, the newspapers were reporting on the unsavory nature of the links between Prince Andrew and this Epstein character when, the antics of Epstein were exposed. And people started to ask questions, well, why is he so closely associated with this guy? But then it was very, very quickly covered up. There was a statement from Buckingham Palace where Prince Andrew denied any kind of improper activity connected with Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, well, that's that then. It must be true. I had expected him to put his hands up and say, you've got me. Yeah, I'm a paedophile. But for some reason he didn't. And that seemed to be enough for people. The general British public, Buckingham Palace issue a statement saying Prince Andrew's done nothing wrong. The papers just shut up about it. The story's no longer reported and it all goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And so most people, the average Joe in the street here now probably wouldn't even remember the story. So it's just all gone away the way these things do. So it's just incredible how quick people are to forget things that should be outraging them. The fact that Sir Edward Heath was a child killer should be outraging people. They should be asking, how was it possible that this guy became a serving British Prime Minister? Where were the background checks on him? Why did MI6 consistently fail to turn up these aspects of his character? Why are so many sirs and lords subsequently exposed as paedophiles? Why was Jimmy Savile knighted by the Queen twice? Where were the background checks by MI5 and MI6 there, given that Savile was closely associated with the royals? People should be losing their minds about this stuff. People should be outraged and taking to the streets at the fact that the BBC has housed and employed so many paedophiles over the years, and it's all come to light now that they have, and that we're still required to pay a license fee to watch TV. It's basically a TV tax, and people are still obediently paying it, knowing that it's going to fund an organisation that, when it's not providing, it's not being apologists for terrorists by peddling, the official version of 9/11 and 7/7 and all these other false flag terror events, which are provably false and can't have happened the way they're being reported. When they're not doing that, they're housing and providing a platform for child rapists. People should be going mad at all this stuff, but they're not. So I don't know what it's going to take for people to ever get to those levels of outrage. I think if they cancelled EastEnders or Coronation Street, or took the football off, or removed Simon Cowell from the X Factor, then maybe people would lose their minds then. But it's difficult to see how anything else is going to do it. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant, and It's a long-winded way of answering your question about Epstein, but yes, I heard some stuff about Jeffrey Epstein, and it was very quickly covered up here, so I don't think we got to hear the whole story.
Well, yeah, there's connections, but there's evidence that his mansion, where some of these things were going on, the local police reports have it that they found audiovisual equipment there, and he, of course, his connections to Robert Maxwell, because his daughter worked for him, Ghislaine
Right.
Maxwell, who reportedly
Sure.
procured young girls for him. And
And he
Robert,
just happened to fall off his boat in
yes,
1991.
and
And we've never seen him.
he was linked to the Mossad, and of course, if you think of Epstein, he's what indications there what's going on there is some sort of intelligence operation again, because you have all these officials going on and going to his island, and that would indicate this maybe some sort of blackmail operation going on there, which is
Yeah.
maybe perhaps the why the George W. Bush Justice Department quashed the investigation and arranged this slap on the wrist plea deal, which is now being scrutinized.
Right. I did wonder if there was any connection between Jeffrey Epstein and Brian Epstein of the Beatles, and also Paul's first wife, Linda Eastman, as she was known by her maiden name. Her family name was actually Epstein as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so her father was known as Lee Eastman, but that was a kind of Americanized version of his real name, which was Leopold Epstein. And I think he was a Russian Jewish immigrant, if I remember correctly, that came to the United States. And he changed his name from Epstein to Eastman to fit into American society more, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I've looked for any links between Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, and Linda Epstein, Paul's first wife, and this Jeffrey Epstein character. But as far as I can find out, they're all completely unrelated. I've not been able to find any links. It would have been very interesting if there had been family links there, but I don't think there are. I think it is one of those rare instances of coincidence that we
Yeah.
have so many Epsteins in this story.
Well, I mean, back to the Paul McCartney thing. Guess supposedly his death or replacement was the fall of 1966, and
Yep,
that would coincide with his, I guess, broken engagement with Jane Asher,
that's right.
and which was unexplained. And then that's when Linda McCartney kind of slips into, or Linda Eastman slips into the scene there. And she was a rock and roll photographer, right? She was like
Yeah,
in the
that's right.
scene. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting stuff with Jane Asher. And Nick Kollerstrom gets into this big time in his book, the one that I mentioned earlier. There's a story that Jane Asher came home unexpected one time to the house that she lived in with Paul, and she found him in bed with another woman. And so some accounts are that it was Linda, and then other accounts are that it was somebody else. But either way, the kind of myth or the legend or the story is that she then decided to split with him, which paved the way for him to strike up this relationship with Linda. But Jane Asher, when you get into her family background, I mean, time and time again, as I hinted at earlier, there are connections into military intelligence and government departments. And you get that with Jane Asher's father as well. He was a scientist that worked, he studied the effects of LSD, actually, for the British establishment. And he was involved in research, laboratory research into psychiatry and, you know, the effects on the human mind of stimulants like LSD. So he was doing that kind of work. And Paul famously moved into the Wimpole Street home in London of the Ashers. And he's said to have lived there, and he composed many of his famous songs there. So the story goes. And something very interesting happened when Jane Asher's father went missing in 1969. So this would be 3 years after the alleged switch of McCartney. And by the way, there are photographs of the original Paul with Jane Asher where they're pretty much the same height. And it would seem that when the imposter Paul, you know, 4, was brought in to replace the original McCartney, whatever the circumstances were, for a time he was required to be seen out in public with Jane Asher to present the impression that the relationship was ongoing. So there are also photographs you can get of 4, fake Paul, with Jane Asher, where he's a good 3 to 4 inches above her. So unless he's wearing Cuban heels, he's suddenly sprouted overnight in height by about 4 inches. He's towering above her. You know, I think that is one of the main visual clues when you put photographs side by side of the original Paul and the fake Paul alongside Jane Asher. So it would seem that Paul, you know, at least in public, was seen to be continuing that relationship with Jane Asher. But her father disappeared unexpectedly in 1969, and they didn't know where he was. And according to the story, about 3 days later, his body showed up in the basement of their house. Apparently, nobody had thought to look in the basement, but he just sort of turned up dead. And the official verdict of the coroner was that he'd committed suicide. So you have some very strange circumstances there surrounding Jane Asher's father. And if you consider the possibility that all these actors, as we referred to them as earlier, whether they're rock stars or whether they're girlfriends and partners of rock stars or whether they're other types of celebrities, if they're put into the public domain, into the public eye, as part of these projects and these programs that come out of military intelligence and come out of the government services, then they're playing this role the whole time. And the reason that they're there is through these family connections. So for whatever reason, it's possible that it was decided that Dr. Richard Asher, Jane's father, had outlived his usefulness, or that he knew too much, and he was suicided, because you find that so many times in the backstory of the industry, a whole load of suicides, in inverted commas, and a whole load of accidental overdoses. And Jane Asher's mother was a music teacher, and among her clients was one George Martin. She actually taught George Martin in classical music, and a whole load of the production methods that he employed in the records of the Beatles had been taught to him by Jane Asher's mother. Isn't that an interesting connection?
Very interesting. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
So and then her daughter just happens to grow up to be an actress that Paul McCartney ends up dating for a while and was engaged to.
That's right. And Jane Asher to this day has never divulged anything slightly nefarious about what happened with the Beatles in those years. She just will not talk about it. She will not be drawn on anything other than the official version of things. And it's interesting to me that if this Paul McCartney replacement really did take place in 1966, and I'm pretty convinced that it did, then the number of individuals that would have been personally involved in those activities that are still around today to tell the tale, if they chose to, can be counted probably on one hand, let alone two. Mm-hmm. And they're diminishing by the year. So earlier this year, we lost George Martin, who, if this replacement took place, George Martin would surely have known about it. He would have been in a position to be fully aware of what happened. But we're not going to get his story anymore. Then last year, Cynthia Lennon died, John's first wife. And she actually hinted that something was going on in the Beatles camp in her autobiography, which was called A Twist of Lennon, which she published some years back. And she said that round about 1966, some really strange things started to happen in the Beatles camp. So she didn't really elaborate on it, but she certainly hinted that there was stuff happening around 1966, which is a very key year, as I've pinpointed in my book, in terms of stuff that was starting to happen and all these social changes that were being brought in. So we're not going to hear Cynthia Lennon's story because she's died now. Then you had Cilla Black, who was very closely associated with the Beatles. She was a contemporary of theirs out of Liverpool in the 1960s. She died last year, so we're not going to get her story. So pretty much all we have is Ringo, Yoko Ono, May Pang, who was John Lennon's girlfriend on his famous Lost Weekend period. And I've heard her do a few interviews in recent years, actually. I heard her on the Ed Opperman report quite recently. And she's kind of sticking to the official version of everything when it comes to the Beatles. And there was nothing in what she said in that interview to hint that she was going to reveal stuff that nobody had previously heard. So, there's not a whole load of others. Oh, Pete Best is still around, the original drummer. And Pete Best was kicked out of the Beatles to make way for Ringo. But we don't hear anything from that guy now, but he is still alive.
Now, some of these other, again, another example of a band that can be used for cultural programming. Of course, the Beatles and the whole Beatlemania phenomenon. In the U.S., we had the Grateful Dead.
Yeah,
and they've been linked to MK Ultra. Through
CIA assets, right?
CIA assets. Billy and Peggy Mellon Hitchcock bankrolled them. This is the Hitchcock, the Mellon fortune family,
right?
And of course, the Robin Hunter has been linked to MK Ultra, and basically the whole I guess the whole idea behind that operation was the creation of America's drug counterculture that was a part of MK Ultra, which we alluded to or discussed earlier regarding the Life magazine cover in 1957.
Right.
But this is consistent with the MK Ultra project going on in California and I guess New York too. But you had the CIA operating these safe houses that were distributing LSD to unwittingly to people and testing what the results would be. They would have prostitutes pick up men and put them on LSD and film it. This was Operation Midnight Climax. But at some point, the plan was to widely distribute LSD among the population, and this was largely done through these rock festivals. Whether it's Monterey Pop or even Woodstock. Of course, these things were widely promoted by the establishment. But that's an example here in the United States where an entire counterculture is being created by the very establishment that the counterculture is supposed to be fighting. So
sure, yeah,
I mean,
that's the crazy thing about it.
And the link there is, of course, you have Timothy Leary, who's said tune on. Was it
tune in, drop out?
Drop out, which was a line he got from Marshall McLuhan. And Timothy Leary, who
was the mantra of that hippie era, was the whole turn on, tune in, drop out.
And Leary had since, as it has claimed to have been working for the CIA, he broke out of prison, or was broken out of prison supposedly by the Weather Underground, which is probably a setup there. But he was linked to, he himself was linked to Mary Pinchot Meyer, who had an affair with John F. Kennedy, who reportedly gave John F. Kennedy LSD.
Right. Yeah, there's connections everywhere you look, into politics, into everything.
Yeah,
and everyone in that era, all the key players, it would seem, were CIA assets, and it's come out that they were, from Timothy Leary to Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters. He's said to have been working for the CIA, and he's said to have been a mind control subject himself, a product of MK Ultra, and Gordon Warson, that did the research into magic mushrooms and went on that famous trip to Mexico, which was CIA sponsored and funded, as Jan Irvin has revealed. And all these key players, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead would just appear to be products of the CIA as well, sent into that whole scene to kind of steer it off in a certain direction. And then you had the arrival of LSD coinciding with pretty much the arrival of the contraceptive pill, the birth control pill as well. So you've got LSD and guys like Timothy Leary encouraging all these kids to drop out and take acid and make love, not war. And at the very same time, you've got the contraceptive pill, which led to attitudes of sexual emancipation and sexual freedom, and people were much more, sexually experimental and open and liberal. So all these social changes occurring in tandem with each other. And in the background, you've got the soundtrack to it all, which is all this psychedelic experimental music, which is very different to anything that went before. All these social changes happening in such a short period of time, the mid to late 1960s, they really did do a number on that generation in terms of social manipulation and trauma, you might even say, in many ways. And if you expand it to the whole decade of the 1960s, and you look at all the world-shattering events that took place, from the Kennedy assassinations to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and then the Manson family murders, the Apollo moon landing hoax, which is surely what it was, all this talk of the age of Aquarius, this new astrological age, which was supposed to coincide with this whole hippie era, although many astrologers that you speak to say that the age of Aquarius is nowhere near upon us yet, and we've got quite a while to go. Nobody seems to be able to pinpoint an exact date for the start of it, but there was talk of it at the time. That's the point. There was this element to things as well. And it seems to me that they had the generation known as the baby boomers in their sights. So this is the generation that was born at the tail end of the Second World War. There was this big population increase as the Second World War ended. So from the mid to late 1940s, large number of babies being born, and they were all coming of age in the 1960s. So from the mid to late 1960s, the baby boomers were coming into adulthood, and they were the ones that were being targeted by all this social manipulation. And there would be some reason why they just decided to completely traumatize and socially engineer that particular generation. because the society that we had in the 1970s at the tail end of all this stuff bore absolutely no resemblance to the way American society and, I would say global, if it wasn't for the Flat Earth crew. So I'll say worldwide society was very, very different to the way it had been in the early 1960s. And it was all achieved in just a relatively short number of years, with all this stuff working together, working in tandem with each other. And there were social changes happening in the UK at exactly the same time as it was being rolled out in the US. So is that by coincidence, or does that suggest some kind of coordination between agencies on both sides of the Atlantic, So, the cultural legacy of the 1960s is still being felt today in so many ways, and it changed society beyond recognition.
And the important point here is that it wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't organic. It was manipulated and developed out of the think tanks, the intelligence agencies, and the foundations. Because
we're led to believe it was spontaneous.
Yeah.
The official version, the Wikipedia version of it, would have you believe that all these kids, all these hippies, just started expressing themselves in this way and started creating this music and started opposing the Vietnam War. And LSD just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and it's just one of those things. So we're being asked to believe that it was all spontaneous. But what are the chances of all this stuff coming together at exactly the same time if left to chance? Come on now.
Yes. I mean, what you had here, particularly here in the United States, in the post-war era, you had the deliberate plan to suburbanize the country. That was break up the ethnic neighborhoods and create suburbia. At the same time, Madison Avenue is working with Hollywood to create the teenager. And this is done through the movies like James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause.
Right.
Music itself, prior to the 1950s, music wasn't generational. It transcended the generations. Music became generational, meaning that kids listen to certain type of music, adults listen to other types of music. And you also had the development of certain social movements that weren't organic. Feminism itself was a creation out of the foundations and the intelligence agencies. Gloria Steinem admits to being a CIA asset. Ms. Magazine was funded by the Washington Post and a few selected billionaires to promote feminism, to achieve create this trauma, to create divide society along the sexes. As you mentioned, you also had a lot of this musical changes coincided along with the development of the contraceptive pill, which would change sexual mores.
Sure.
A lot of this was to change the demographics of the country, to change the politics of the country. Because when you mentioned the baby boom in the United States, that was largely Catholic driven in the Second World. So, but of course, the rise of Catholic power in the United States disturbed the WASP elite here in this country. They even elected a president in 1960. The Catholics did.
Right.
So what you had, in order to weaken Catholic power, which was a big check on not only the WASP elite, but also the Jewish elite, particularly Hollywood, they had to destroy Catholic identity, the ethnic neighborhoods, the idea of the Italian Catholic, the German Catholic, the Polish Catholic, disperse them into suburbia, and they'd just become the white middle class. And that's when the psychological warfare kicks in with the music and the entertainment. And if you do the research on this, you find this is all being planned.
That's right.
Through so it's when you look at that part of it, it's not too surprising that what you write about, music and entertainment being weaponized to achieve some sort of sociological end, it isn't outlandish. In fact, it becomes very plausible, if not possible.
Exactly. When you look at all this other stuff that was in place and you see all these other connections, then the idea that music wouldn't have been employed as part of that plan suddenly becomes ridiculous. That becomes the absurd thing to claim, that it wouldn't have been used and it wouldn't have been set to a certain agenda in that way. I don't know how you feel about the way things panned out in the 1970s following the 1960s, because we had all these incredible world events, as I said, and all these social changes that occurred in the 1960s. But to my reckoning, it was all pretty much done by the end of 1969. And you could even make an argument for Woodstock being the kind of, bookending the whole thing of what happened in the 1960s. That was where the agenda was kind of signed off in terms of all these big changes. So you had Woodstock in August 1969. And I think it was about a week or so before Woodstock, the Manson murders in Cielo Drive, Los Angeles.
Hmm.
That was August 69 as well. So it seems to me, and then the Beatles split up in 69, and so that was the end of that whole dream, you know. And it seems that there was something about the decade of the 1960s. And as the 70s dawned and progressed, everything culturally changed and was much less exciting and got a bit kind of drab and boring. And, you know, that decade just kind of dragged on and there was nothing particularly notable or sensational or memorable about it. You know, obviously there was a rock music scene that developed in that decade and went off down its own path. But the 70s was very different to the 1960s. And it just seems to me that there was something special about the 60s. I don't know if there was numerology involved because we're talking about a dark occult priest class here that have
Yeah.
a religious belief system that they operate to. And maybe there was something numerological about the 1960s. I certainly think there was about 1966 because, as I've outlined, that was a year where a whole lot of stuff took place. That's the year that's linked to the Paul McCartney replacement. It's the year that Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan. And it surely can't be a coincidence that 66, as in 666, was chosen as the year for that. You had the movie Rosemary's Baby, which is all about satanic secret societies and how they hide in plain sight. And that movie was released in 1968, but it was set in 1966. So one of the characters points to a calendar of 1966 in the movie, and he says, "This is year one." That's his words. You know, it's year one. It all begins in 1966. So there's a lot of stuff connected to that particular year. And there's all kinds of connections also. You've got the Church of Satan, which it turns out has intrinsic links into the entertainment industry because there were a lot of high profile entertainers that were actually a part of the Church of Satan, such as Sammy Davis Jr. and Jane Mansfield in the 1960s. And then more recently, you've had Marilyn Manson, who's been an ordained priest in the Church of Satan. Mark Almond of Soft Cell has been linked to it. And somebody emailed me yesterday, actually, to point out that there was a very short-lived girl duo called Strawberry Switchblade in the UK in the mid-1980s. And this person suggests that Rose McGowan of Strawberry Switchblade was brought into the Church of Satan by Mark Almond. I've not been able to check that out, but that's another link that somebody has suggested to me. So then you've got links going out from the Church of Satan into this other very shady, questionable organization in the 1960s known as the Process Church.
Hmm.
The Process Church of the Final Judgment, which operated out of San Francisco. And there are various key figures that have been associated with that organization, such as David Berkowitz, who was the son of Sam serial killer, or at least the guy that took the rap for those murders, because many think that there were ritualistic occult elements to the way those murders were done, and that Berkowitz was merely the fall guy for it, and, you know, other forces were at work. But anyway, you've got that. And then you've got Sirhan Sirhan. This is something that was told to me by Ed Opperman when I was on his show. He reckons that Sirhan Sirhan, the guy that is said to have assassinated Robert Kennedy, was seen at a whole bunch of Process Church gatherings and sort of, you know, parties. So there's a suggestion that he came out of that organization, which in turn is linked to the Church of Satan and then into the music industry. The Rolling Stones were very closely associated with Kenneth Anger, this satanic filmmaker, who himself was an associate of Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan. And there are many who think that Kenneth Anger was the real power force behind the Church of Satan, with Anton LaVey just being the sort of public face of it. So now you've got a connection from the Rolling Stones going into the Church of Satan and therefore the Process Church. And the Process Church were involved with Charles Manson and his disciples. And one of them was a guy by the name of Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil was associated with Kenneth Anger once again and was said to be his homosexual lover. And Bobby Beausoleil was recruited to write the soundtrack to the film Lucifer Rising, which is one of Kenneth Anger's famous short films. And so Bobby Beausoleil at the time was in jail for the murder of a music teacher by the name of Gary Hinman, and he composed the soundtrack to Lucifer Rising from his jail cell. And previously, the soundtrack to that movie had been produced by Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who was also in the early days associated with the Rolling Stones. And Mick Jagger provided the soundtrack to Invocation of My Demon Brother, another famous short film of Kenneth Anger. So now you've got connections between the Rolling Stones, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, Kenneth Anger, the Church of Satan, the Process Church of the Final Judgment, the Son of Sam serial killings, and the Manson family murders. Why should there be any connections there at all? And yet there are. It's crazy.
And of course, with the music industry itself, its linkage back to, I guess, the Satan or the devil. That goes back to this idea of Robert Johnson, right? He sold his soul to play the blues.
Yeah,
at the crossroads.
That's the myth and the legend that we get. You know, he's like the original artist that's heralded as having sold his soul in exchange for fame and fortune. So there's this legend that he met the devil at a crossroads, which is supposed to be a place where this world, this realm meets the supernatural realm and entities can be brought through. And the story is that Robert Johnson traded his mortal soul to the devil in exchange for great musical talent. And from that point, he became a very established and accomplished blues musician. And he died in very strange circumstances at the age of 27. So in many ways, he was the original member of what's come to be known as the 27 Club, which is this group of musicians who just happen to have died in some form or other at the age of 27. There are many prominent musicians among their number. One of them actually was a member of the Grateful Dead. There was a guy called Ron McKernan, who was known as Pigpen, out of the Grateful Dead, and he died at the age of 27. And you also have Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, who have I forgotten? Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, and a whole bunch of others.
Yeah, and I think Graham Parsons was like a week shy of his 27th birthday.
Yeah, he didn't quite make it.
Yeah. And there's also, lesser known, but he was the creative force behind Badfinger's Pete Ham.
Right.
He died at 27 too.
You can actually find a reference to the 27 Club on Wikipedia,
yeah.
where they do actually list all the musicians that are said to be a part of it. So you can fill in the blanks there.
Yeah, Anton LaVey is an interesting character because he's like a carnival barker or something, and
yeah, he was a circus lion tamer or something circus performer.
Yeah, a showman, but very much like I guess you could say, someone's like Aleister Crowley in many ways, but because he, like Crowley, he had ties to intelligence. I think Anton LaVey worked for the San Francisco police for a while, and his Church of Satan was founded upon property that was owned by the U.S. military.
Wow.
Near the Presidio.
I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me.
And the Presidio itself was then bought by the Disney Corporation. And, of course, the Presidio, it was, the infamous sex scandals out there regarding the daycare center. And that had ties to, you mentioned him earlier, was Colonel Aquino. The Church of Satan guy who, I guess he found the Temple of Set.
Right.
And not only that, he was also involved in Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. He wrote Psychological Warfare Doctrine for the Pentagon, and was, also the head chaplain for the U.S. military.
That's right.
He's a devil worshiper.
That's right. And just what you mentioned, the connection into Walt Disney there, just reminded me of what I heard about this covert military research facility right in the middle of Laurel Canyon.
Well, that's interestingly too. Yeah.
Yeah, you got this research facility right there in the Hollywood Hills in this area called Laurel Canyon, which had absolutely no musical heritage at all prior to 1965, as Dave McGowan pointed out in his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And so you had all these artists flocking magnet-like to Laurel Canyon from all over the US and beyond, and that created the whole counterculture, folk rock scene that grew up out of Laurel Canyon. And there just happened to be this military, base there.
Yeah, Lookout Mountain.
Yeah, Lookout Mountain. And when you look into the background of that, there are stories that Walt Disney apparently worked there for a time, and Marilyn Monroe is said to have been employed at that facility in some capacity or other.
John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart.
Right.
And they never talked about their work there, and it was supposedly the most advanced studio, special effects.
That's right, yeah.
And this goes back to our idea of occulted knowledge.
Yep.
And this also produced the testing films of the atom bomb.
Right.
I know why they would need that is never explained, but some people have studied the films of the atom bomb tests and have concluded that they're fake. There's a lot of layering, special effect technology used in these things.
Yeah. And then that place was sold and it became a private residence.
Yeah.
And I would have to look up who it is. Somebody somebody connected to the music industry bought that.
Leto or something? Jerry Leto or something?
Yeah, Jay Leno, yeah, the
I
chat
think
show guy.
I think it's Leto, I think, isn't it? Leto or Jerry Leto?
Lido, yeah, whichever, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the point is that again shows the link between the intelligence, military, Hollywood, music, entertainment out there. They're all working together to manipulate the culture, which goes back to what Plato was talking about, right? So,
Well, that's right. We've kind of come full circle, haven't
yeah,
we? And ended up where we started off, which is there are links everywhere between these different institutions that you wouldn't expect to find, and yet you do time and time and time again, decade after decade after decade. So if that doesn't convince people that there's more to know about the true nature of the entertainment industry than what lies on top and all the surface gloss and stuff, then I really don't know what more we could have said.
yeah, and because what you have to do is actually, instead of just listening to a podcast here and there, is actually read the book, right?
Well, yeah, that would be a good option as well, I would say.
Read the book, Musical Truth. And what's the best place to get that book?
Well, it is available on Amazon, so you can get a paperback version, a hardback version, or a Kindle version, as you prefer. If you just type in Mark Devlin Musical Truth in Amazon, you'll find it there. It's on Barnes & Noble as well. But if anyone wants to get a signed copy of the book from me personally, I'm offering to mail those out. It's a better deal for an author to sell books themselves because Amazon takes a big chunk otherwise, and they're not the most ethical company in the world. So if anyone wants to buy a book from me direct, I can sign it and put a message in it. All you got to do is send me an email to mark@markdevlin.co.uk, and if you can pay by PayPal, then I will mail a book out to you. So just drop me an email and we can make it all happen from there. So there's a bit of blurb about the book on musicaltruthbook.com, and all my other activities, including my podcast series. I do two. One is called The Sound of Freedom, which is conscious, meaningful music that uplifts you and comes with a message and is the antithesis to all the spirit-crushing, toxic garbage that you hear on the radio. If you hate all that stuff, then check out this series, because this is real music doing what real music should. So there's that one. Then there's Good Vibrations, which is my conversation-based series. I'm up to 87 volumes there, and I've had everyone on there from David Icke to Mark Passio to Jay Widener to Fritz Springmeier to Freeman to Jay Dyer, anyone you can think of on this scene, really. So that they're all available via my main site, which is markdevlin.co.uk. So that's the link to all my other activities.
I've heard a rumor that you're working on a sequel to Musical Truth.
Yes, I am. I'm going to be bringing out Musical Truth 2. So the plan is the rest of 2016 will be spent promoting this book and doing a whole bunch of interviews like this one. And then 2017, I'm going to knuckle down to researching and writing Volume 2, which I hope to have out in 2018. So there's a whole bunch of subject areas that I couldn't get into this book. There's a whole bunch that I did, such as, we didn't touch on MK Ultra and Monarch programming today, so there's a lot of stuff about that in the book. There's a lot of stuff about the transhumanist scene, the transhumanism agenda, and how that ties into music.
Auto-tuning, right?
Yep, auto-tune is involved, yep. And there's the systematic degeneration of hip-hop culture and black culture generally. So I'm going to go into all of that in this book, Musical Truth Volume 1. But some of the stuff that I couldn't get into it include cymatics and the science of sound, and I really want to understand better what's going on in musical recordings at an unseen level that is affecting people's brainwave states and their energy field and maybe dictating their emotions and their perceptions without them having any idea what's going on, because it's all done in the sound frequencies.
Is that the 432 versus 440?
Yes, it brings it in. Yeah. So
Okay.
I really want to go in on that 432 versus 440 hertz, and getting into the work of Dr. Masuro Emoto, the Japanese guy that did work into how water has consciousness, and when you expose water crystals to certain words, and this can be words in written form or spoken form, or even words in the lyrics of songs, it causes the consciousness in the water to behave in a certain way. And when the water is exposed to words that are charged with malevolent intent or hate or fear, then it produces very discordant, disharmonious patterns. So given that the majority of our bodies are made up of water,
Hmm.
If words and lyrics and sound can have that effect on water, then what is going on in our human bodies and minds when we're exposed to music, so called, that has been produced with malevolent intent applied? So if
Yeah.
the music makers have charged a piece of music with their intent and they want it to have this disturbing uh, negative effect on us, what could be going on at an unseen level. So I want to get into that. And I also want to get into understanding the heavy rock scene a bit more, heavy metal and such. And I mean, that's a genre that's been associated with devil worship and Satanism for decades. And I think most people understand that those associations are there. But I just want to better get into the true nature of what's really going on. And then the electronic dance music scene as well, rave culture, and whether that was a more modern expression of what went on in the original Summer of Love with the hippie explosion in 1967. We had echoes of that happening 21 years later in 1988 when there was ecstasy everywhere,
Hmm.
MDMA. And that was kind of the equivalent of LSD from back in the day. So you had all this amazing new dance music accompanied by this new drug that all the kids were taking. And that changed the fabric of social culture at the tail end of the 1980s and going forward through the 90s as well. So is there evidence of a hidden hand manipulating that scene as well? I'd be very surprised if there wasn't. So all that stuff is what I plan to get into in Musical Truth too.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that you really get into the weeds on that one. That sounds interesting. Yeah, because I've again, if you look at what music, and I think it was the Rockefellers who did research regarding 432 versus
Those nice
440
people.
back in the 20s, and they
Yeah.
decided to go. Which one is it that is less that is disharmonious?
Well, 432 is said to be the harmonious frequency, the love frequency, nature's
Yeah,
frequency.
but they
And
chose.
440 is anything but. 440 is the frequency that you should absolutely not be listening to music at because it has the opposite effect. It's unnatural. It's discordant.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
how that's how it's marketed to us.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, most people aren't even aware that this stuff is going on. Most
Mhm.
people in the street would not even be aware of what 440 hertz is. But musicologists and musicians and those that study this stuff have long been aware that 432 is the one we should be using, and we're not. And it was at the hands of the Rockefeller Foundation that this change took place. So there's a red flag for you.
Right there. So interesting. Well, listen, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I know you're very busy with the interviews, so I'm really grateful for how much time you gave me for this interview. It's great.
Yeah, thanks, man. And we went some different places with this one because with most interviews, I'm going through chapter by chapter what's in the
Yeah.
book. But we really dotted around and went some interesting places with this.
Well,
So,
that's what I wanted to do, and I stress if you're listening to this and to listen to to buy the book, of course, but also just go to your podcast and also listen to the various interviews you've done on this topic. Because there are a few where you go by chapter and you go by detail and some of the things you're talking about.
yeah, I think our mutual friend Ivan from Phoenix, Ivan interviewed me. I know he's interviewed you as well.
Yeah.
And he interviewed me on my own podcast and sort of he was the host. He jumped on as the host and he said, okay, talk us through chapter by chapter what's in the book. So I did break down exactly what's in there in that interview, and that's part of my Good Vibrations podcast. But I've learned a lot from you on this one, man.
Well,
I mean,
thank you.
I've picked up some bits of information from you, so that's a worthwhile interview.
Yeah, you have that interview posted on your website with Ivan from Phoenix, right?
Yeah, they're all there. All my Good Vibrations podcasts are grouped together on my SoundCloud page, actually. But you can link through to the SoundCloud from my main website, markdevlin.co.uk. And anyone that wants to send me an email, whether you want to get a book, whether you want to correspond with me or share some information with me, or whether you just want to get pointed towards where all these interviews are, just drop me an email to mark@markdevlin.co.uk. I respond to every email I get. And I'm always happy to hear from people, unless they're CIA agents and shills and troublemakers, in which case you won't get a reply because I don't go there.
Okay, great. Listen, thanks, Mark, and listen, enjoy the remains of your holiday,
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
and maybe we'll talk later in the future.
All right, man. Good to kick it to you. Cheers.
Good day. Thanks. Bye.